A listener wrote as follows: some people contemplate the 10 Sefirot mentioned in Kabbalistic writings in order to attain a higher level of consciousness. Is this a legitimate practice? Is it recommended?
Before addressing that question specifically regarding contemplations and meditations, regarding the Esel Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot mentioned in Kabbalah, first a few words regarding the concept of the 10 Sefirot. What exactly are these 10 Sefirot according to those who have learnt and those who teach Kabbalah today and in the past? If we examine this issue, if we research all the different opinions and materials written on this subject over the last 700 odd years, we discover that there was most certainly not one view or understanding of this concept of the Esel Sefirot, but in fact a number of positions. The major point of difference between various Mekubalim, between various Kabbalists, was the issue as to the nature of these Sefirot. Are these Sefirot to be viewed as each one in and of itself is some form of divinity, or are they composed of, or do they comprise divinity, or not? And if not, what exactly do they represent, or what do they mean, or what exactly is the power or the concept that is meant by this term of Sefirot? This issue was addressed exhaustively and very thoroughly by the Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, a very original and unique Chacham, sage, who lived in Italy in the 19th century, according to the Christian calendar. He wrote a wikuah, which means essentially a debate between two individuals on the subject of the origins of Kabbalah, the authenticity of Kabbalah, and the meaning of the Sefirot according to the Kabbalah. In fact, it was not a real debate between two individuals, as he himself admits at the end of the book. It was a literally device to present the different positions. And in this work, he collects the various views of various Mekubalim, Kabbalists, on this very subject, as to the nature of the 10 Sefirot. And he quotes those who explicitly say that the 10 Sefirot are not to be understood as divinity or divine objects in and of themselves. And there are those who expressly and explicitly say the opposite, that they are to be viewed exactly in such a way. Without going into all the details and the different positions, it's sufficient here to mention that the well-known author of the Shla is a famous book called the Shnei Luchot HaBrith, Rabbi Yeshayahu Horovitz, says explicitly that the 10 Sefirot are Elohuth. Elohuth means they are divine. And this, of course, if one accepts that position, and this was a position that was, in earlier generations at least, much more common amongst the Mekubalim, those who studied Kabbalah. Nowadays, I think you'll be very hard-pressed to find anyone amongst those who do study Kabbalah who would repeat such a view or who would defend such a position. But this was certainly one of the two major positions with regards to this question. So without going into all of the details, it's clear that if a person regards the 10 Sefirot mentioned in Kabbalah as 10 divine objects or concepts or realities which are of themselves of a divine nature, then immediately one opens oneself up to the criticism, the very obvious criticism, that if the Christians believe in a Trinity, and that this is something that the Jews could never accept, because it was viewed as being fundamentally opposed to the concept of the oneness and the unity of Hashem, of God, then such Mekubalim in fact believe in a system of 10 rather than 3, which is even worse. And this very claim was made by a number of great sages in the past, going back hundreds of years. The earliest Chacham to make this claim, to the best of my knowledge, was Rabbi Avraham Abulafia, who was a great Kabbalist, but not at all a Kabbalist who belonged to the school of the 10 Sefirot, etc., as they were taught. And as this system developed in Spain in the 13th century, he was opposed to that system altogether. He was of a different school of mystical studies and contemplations, and he says so about himself quite explicitly, and he levels this argument against the Mekubalim, who believe in the 10 Sefirot. He says because they essentially are like the Christians. The Christians have 3 and they have 10. And this very same argument is mentioned in a teshuvah of the Rivage. The Rivage, of course, is the very famous posek and one of the latter-day Rishonim, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, who was a Talmid Muvhak of the Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, and he writes in Siman Kof Nun Zayin in his Teshuvot, he mentions such a claim in the name of a certain philosophically inclined Jew. He doesn't mention the name. And then he goes on to say, to relate the following. He says that it occurred once when I was in Saracosta that I was speaking to the famous Rav Yosef ibn Shushan. And he goes on to say, and he praises him as being a great sage in all areas of the Torah, including Kabbalah. The Rivage was not a great believer in Kabbalah. He writes explicitly about himself in this very teshuvah that he did not spend time and he deliberately avoided the study of Kabbalah. And he says that I had the following discussion with him. He said, I know that some of the Mekubalim, when they pray, when they say the Shemona Esrei, they contemplate and they meditate on a particular sefirah connected, according to their view, to that particular bracha that they are saying at that moment. So at different points in their tefillah, they are contemplating and meditating upon various sefirot. And he asked him, why do people do this? Why do these Mekubalim believe so? And why do they believe that these Sefirot are divine? And are they in fact praying to these Sefirot? And then he relates the response that Rabbi Yosef ibn Shushan gave him. He said as follows. He said, no, he said, all prayer is to be directed to Hashem, and only to Hashem. But if a person comes before the king and has a request, for example, he claims that he was part of a case that came before a court of law, and he believes there was a miscarriage of justice, and therefore he appeals to the king that the case be reviewed. So the king will send this person to the Minister of Justice, or to the Ministry of Justice, that they deal with this issue. And if he requests some financial relief or something of that sort, he will be directed to turn to the people in charge of the state treasury, etc. In other words, he says the person's request is directed to the king, but the king will then send him on to, or make some order or request of the individuals whose job it is to deal with that particular field of endeavor, that particular area of government, and he will direct them to do what has to be done. In the same way, he says the Sefirot are like the individual ministries or ministers in charge of different functions of the government. They are all working for Hashem, so to speak, and that is the purpose, that is the idea behind concentrating on or contemplating the Sefirot during prayer. The Rivage, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshet, goes on to say, with regards to this explanation that he heard from Rabbi Yosef ben Shushan, he says that explanation is possible. In other words, it makes some sense. In other words, it certainly refutes the claim and deflects the claim that the Kabbalists understood the Sefirot to be individual deities. But he says, why do we need to do such a thing in the first place? Why not just simply pray to Hashem? And Hashem knows exactly what has to be done, and He will take care of the procedures and the mechanisms whereby this matter will be dealt with. And therefore, why does one have to contemplate this or that Sefirah? That's the first thing he says in response to this whole approach to understanding both the way in which the created world works, and also how we should relate to Hashem's running of the world, and how we should, to whom and to what we should address ourselves, and what we should have in mind when praying. He actually goes on to say more. He mentions that which he heard directly from his teacher, the famous Rabbeinu Nisim the Ran, who was a student, a Talmid of the Rashba, who was in turn a Talmid, a student of both Rabbeinu Yonah and the Ramban. He quotes what he heard from the Ran, who said that in his view, the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, altogether took the study of Kabbalah too seriously, and spent too much time on it, and was too much involved in such discussions and such studies. This is a rather brave and courageous and very direct attack, in some ways, one could say, on the Ramban. The Ran was expressing a position which few would have dared to express, but this is what the Ran said, and this is what the Rivage quotes, and therefore the Rivage ends this particular paragraph in his Teshuvah with the words, "Lachen baharti leval yeh li esek banistaroth," and therefore it has been my choice, my decision has been not to study Kabbalah and to really have nothing to do with it. And it's the entire tenor of this Teshuvah, which is much longer. I've only referred to a few lines of it here. The entire tenor of this Teshuvah indicates quite clearly that the Rivage had very serious doubts about Kabbalah in general. And here we should mention another Teshuvah, another halachic and Torah response to this issue of Kabbalah and Sefirot in general by the Rashbash. The Rashbash was the son of the Rashbats. The Rashbats was Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach, and his son was Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon. They were amongst the very greatest of the Chachamim, the sages, towards the end of the period of the Rishonim. And he writes in a Teshuvah in Siman Kof Peth, he writes as follows about people who study Kabbalah. In fact, this whole section he wrote criticizing those who studied Kabbalah. He said, by and large, these people are ignoramuses or close to being so, and they choose to study things, he says, which are vague and easy to achieve some level of success, and it's easy also and perhaps expedient to be able to bandy about one's knowledge of such things because it impresses people, when in fact what they're doing is avoiding difficult, much more difficult and demanding studies of Torah, such as understanding the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Psak Halacha, etc. And he criticizes these people quite roundly. He says here as follows, I'll quote just a couple of lines. He says, these people themselves who study Kabbalah and speak of the Sefirot, they themselves do not know, he says, what these Sefirot are. And he says, if they understand these Sefirot to be, as it were, names or descriptions of Hashem, if that's the case, they're not divine entities, they're not deities. And if, on the other hand, they believe them to be somehow encapsulate some divine essence, and they are separate from Hashem, then they are some additional divine object beyond and outside of Hashem. And in that case, he says, and here again we hear the same claim that we mentioned before, Im ken, he says, Im han-nosrim to'anim ha-shlishiyuth. If the Christians claim and believe in a Trinity, elu, these people, to'anim ha-asiriyuth, these people believe in a system which speaks of 10 divine aspects or objects, or however one wishes to define this concept. The Rashbash goes on to say, and he ends in fact this section with the following words. He says that these people, by and large, are students of Torah who studied some Torah but not nearly enough. People who prefer, he says, people who prefer, they choose to avoid the difficult and demanding study of Halakha, of Mishnah, of Talmud, with the Perushim, with the commentaries of the Rishonim, of the early sages. And therefore they choose lehithpa'er b'chokhmat Kabbalah. They choose to make a name for themselves and to put on the airs of being very pious and people who know all kinds of secret, esoteric knowledge, etc. So says the Rashbash, and along similar lines we understand something very similar from the Teshuvah that we mentioned before, the Rivage. Now I know that some people will say in response to these sources that, well, these particular Chachamim were not Mekubalim. The Rivage says so about himself quite explicitly. They perhaps did not believe in the Kabbalah at all, or they certainly had serious doubts about its authenticity, or at least about the way that many people had been studying it and understanding the concepts therein. But certainly there are other people who did believe in Kabbalah, who did study Kabbalah, who encouraged others to study Kabbalah, who thought differently. And I'm not denying that there must be such people, many such people in fact, throughout the ages. But I feel that here we have to mention that even amongst those who studied Kabbalah and told others that they should also do so, the greatest amongst them were very much opposed to most people contemplating or meditating on the Sefirot or on various aspects of Kabbalistic, mystical kavanot, what are called kavanot, that is to say, particular kinds of ideas or ideas that one should focus on during tefillah, during prayer. Even though within the system of Kabbalah there is such a field of endeavor called the kavanot, they were opposed to most people having anything to do with such things. And here I would like to quote from Rabbi Nachman Breslov. I wish to quote from the very end, almost the very end of Likutei Moharan, which is many of the collected teachings of Rabbi Nachman Breslov. This is in the second section, Siman Chof Chaf 120. And it says as follows, that Rabbi Nachman Breslov was once speaking to one of his Hasidim, one of his followers. And Rabbi Nachman Breslov had previously encouraged this person to study Kabbalah, as is mentioned here explicitly. He had told him that he should study Kabbalah, including the idea of the kavanot, the particular ideas that one should focus on during tefillah. But, as becomes apparent from what we're about to read here, his intention was that the person could study these things. He was not opposed to that. In fact, he was for that. It goes without saying that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov himself was a great Mekubal, a Kabbalist. He was one of the great Hasidic masters, and his entire worldview and his teachings are completely imbued with, in fact saturated with Kabbalah. That goes without saying. But his intention was, when he told this person to study Kabbalah, was to study to perhaps be somehow enlightened by these studies, but not that he should actively meditate on these things or contemplate these concepts during tefillah. And he understood from his conversation with this person that this person was in fact doing so. He was in fact praying the Shmoneh Esrei with these kavanot, with these particular ideas, focusing on these particular Kabbalistic formulae and words and concepts. And when he understood this, he reprimanded him, and he told him, it says here as follows, وَيْقْپِيدْ عَلَوْ رَبَّنُ زَال. Rabbi Nachman was displeased, very displeased with this, when he understood that this person was doing so. وَأَمَالُ شَلَوْ يَعْصَوْكْ أَذْ بَزَيْ, that he should no longer do this, he should discontinue this practice. وَلَوْ يِثْپَرَلِمْ كَوَنَوْث, and he should not any more pray with these kavanot, with these Kabbalistic meditative ideas. Rak yichawen perush hamilot kipshuto. Rather, when he prays the Shmoneh Esrei, he should just think of the plain meaning of the words and nothing else. And he went on to say, Mi she'eno ra'ui lezeh, a person who is not of that level to pray with these mystical musings and contemplations. A person who is not on the right level, and obviously Rabbi Nachman felt that very few people were on such a level, a person who does this during his tefillah, during his prayer, contemplates certain ideas or words or formulations based on Kabbalah as part of his prayer, he said that is basically turning his prayer into a kind of witchcraft, kishuf. And this is something very serious and something to be something that one must not do. And he went on to say that Chazal also discuss the fact that certain things can be learnt but should not be put into practice. And he says, for those few people on that level, for them, these kavanot, these mystical ideas and meditations and contemplations are naturally part of their tefillah. It's not something extra that they have to add to their tefillah. It's not some external instruction that they take upon themselves and act upon. It is something which is automatically, organically, and as it were, inexorably involved and part of what they are thinking and what they are saying. The interesting thing, therefore, from this quote, this event that took place with Rabbi Nachman in Breslov, this conversation that he had with one of his followers, the interesting thing to note is that even amongst those who were very much involved in the study of Kabbalah and also in the dissemination of Kabbalistic ideas, many of them were very much opposed to the vast majority of Jews getting involved in practical, meditative, contemplative practices with regards to these ideas. This they saw as something which was way beyond the realm of the vast majority of Jews, even learned Jews, and it was something they actively discouraged. And so, therefore, it is, in my view, this is not a practice to be encouraged, a person who wishes to achieve a higher level of consciousness, who wishes to come closer to Hashem, is, in my view, much better off taking a perek of Tehillim, a perek chapter from the Book of Psalms, and studying it and reading it and reciting it with great fervor. And another teaching of Rabbi Nachman Breslov was that the main thing when it comes to reading and studying Tehillim is to find oneself in that perek of Tehillim, to see how the words almost magically refer to every person. Every person can find themselves and their spiritual yearnings and needs and desires expressed in the most sublime and incredible fashion, something which is beyond the capability of mere mortals. And this kind of practice is something which brings a person closer to Hashem, whereas Kabbalistic contemplations, etc., are usually more of a vehicle for expressing a person to expressing his conceit, his view of himself as a particularly profound individual, and he's essentially misleading himself. So this is something not to be encouraged, but rather quite clearly to be discouraged.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.